Hello, welcome. So I hope this isn't too blurry for you and you'll be able to see what I'm explaining today. So I'm going to be talking to you very briefly about how to turn straight grain into bias. We're just going to be using something very simple. I'm going to be using my little bodice that I always draw. Okay. So normally when you make your little basic bodice in your skirt and your sleeve and all those other pieces, you put them on the straight grain. Even when you buy these from the store and they're store-bought patterns, they're normally always on the straight grain. But you can, if you would like to, change these to the bias if you would want. You will have to do a little bit of refitting though. Areas like the neck, the armhole, the dart, the way it's sewn, and the side seam are naturally already at biases, if that's the right word, or at different degrees of bias. Even the shoulder seam is at its own bias. So, you can always take this and, let's say, I think about here would be bias. Yeah. Okay. Now, just changing the grain line is not going to automatically make it a perfectly fitting bias garment. It will put it on the bias, but you will have some issues. Something that I've learned from working with the bias, and basically what you're drawing on here, let me say this little note, you're actually drawing the direction that the straight grain is going to go. The pattern itself is what is going to change, and you're going to cut it in relation to the straight grain. I hope I'm not saying that too crazy, but anyway, so this basically is still the straight grain. So you're going to place this on the straight grain, but because of how the straight grain is drawn on the pattern, the straight grain is pointing, it's hard to explain, but the straight grain being drawn diagonally across the pattern puts the pattern on a bias. You're still basically using the straight grain. It's just, once you look at this normally, that's basically what it looks like when you turn your pattern the correct way. Like I said, the only difference is this is pointing diagonally, but it's just telling you the straight grain is going to go like this on the fabric. So if you have stripes or whatever, this is the direction it's going to go. So that puts the up and down, the normal up and down of the garment at a bias, okay? Or basically at the diagonal. And that's how that works. And this is the straight. Okay. And this is the normal straight on here. Okay. So basically, so what do you do with it after the fact? So you're basically going to be enlarging the pattern some, because if you're on my email newsletter, you've seen my emails. At the time of this taping, it was like the previous week. We talked about bias the entire week. So basically, what I talked about in there was how those Chinese finger traps are like bias. The Chinese finger traps are the same as when you put a piece of a pattern on the bias. In the same way that those little finger traps are like this, and we'll do this on the end, kind of make it jagged. But basically, those little finger traps are done like this. Now, the way that the finger traps work is if you put your fingers into the ends, the finger trap scrunches down and becomes like this. But when it scrunches, because of how it's made, it also becomes wider. Okay? So it expands this way. But notice when you make it shorter, it expands this way and shrinks vertically. Okay? When after you put your fingers in and you try to pull your fingers back out, then it elongates this way, but it becomes even skinnier. Okay. And that basically, in a nutshell, will teach you, like, if you can get a hold of one of those finger traps and kind of watch the weaving as you make it shorter or make it stretch it out, make it longer. If you pay attention to the weaving tends to do this number and be smaller up here and wider here when you're stretching it long ways. Okay, and then the weaving, the angle on the weave changes and it's wider here and it gets shorter here. This area squeezes down. And you're basically just doing this number. So when you stretch it long ways, it does like this, and it becomes skinnier on the top and on the bottom, the angle between the opening. And then once you scrunch it down and make it bigger, it becomes wider on the ends and shorter in the middle. This moving is basically what this is going to do. This is what the bias does naturally, because your fabric is woven, and there's a lot of different weaves of woven fabric, which is fabric that doesn't stretch. But your basic weave, like of a cotton muslin or something like that, is just your up, down, up, down, up, down, and then your, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over and over and over and over again, until it makes the fabric dense enough to where you can't see through it. That's how you get that. The bias that we're looking at is like this. So if you just look at this, this looks exactly like our Chinese finger trap thing. And the bias works, like I said, exactly the same as the Chinese finger trap. So when you put something on the dress form that was originally made for straight grain and you just automatically try to move it over to bias without switching it, 9 times out of 10, you're going to stretch it this way. And it's going to automatically stretch because you're trying to, you're going to put pins in to make your straight grain fit. So that's going to stretch the straight grain just a little bit, or not the straight grain, the center front. That's what I was trying to say. You're going to put pins in to make the center front fit, and that's going to stretch that a little bit just because that's how it's going to happen. So the fibers are going to start to do this. And then the same thing when you put pins in your shoulder and you put pins down here. By the time you finish pinning, you're going to notice this is going to start to bubble just a little bit, or it's going to start to kind of womp just a little bit. And it's not going to fit as nice as your straight grain pattern was fitting. That's because the stretching process is starting to do this. Now, the crazy thing about the bias on a piece of fabric and the bias on a Chinese finger trap, the weave is the pieces of paper that make up the bias, the Chinese finger trap, are much thicker than the yarns in fabric. You can make this go back and forth without a whole lot of resistance, just because it's a big piece of paper, going both of these ways, and you're just stretching it, moving it back and forth, so you can put your finger in and get your finger out. On a piece of fabric, once those threads have kind of shifted, because you have your, like this. So once those threads have kind of shifted, you're going to have a hard time getting those threads to shift back, which is why the bias doesn't work coming straight from the grain. So you have to enlarge it some, and at least that way you can refit it. And I was reading in my pattern book too, it would probably be a good idea to try to move your dart so that it's not going with the bias. Move your dart so that it's going with the straight grain. So if the straight grain is going this way and then the cross grain is going this way, you want your dart to be going just like that. So you could make your dart here, and then your dart wouldn't stretch. You could take your dart away from here. So that way your dart would be in a more optimal position to work with the way you have the grain going now. And then this growing that you're going to do is because, I didn't finish explaining, once it starts to stretch this way, it's going to start to shrink towards the center of the fabric because of what we were talking about. If you stretch it long ways, so if I take my arms to illustrate, if you stretch it long ways, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. If you stretch it long ways, it's going to come in this way. Because all of that, you see the distance between my hands as it shrinks horizontally as it starts to get longer vertically. And that's the problem you're going to have. This is going to get smaller as you start to fit it in, the fabric starts to relax and the fabric starts to stretch. So that's why you need to grow it on the outside. So it can be done, you just have to do a little bit of refitting if you're going to do it. But this is for woven fabrics, okay? With stretched knit fabrics, you really don't have to do this because knit's already stretched. And you can just use the normal straight grain, not with a pattern that's made for wovens. You have to have a pattern that's made for knits. Most woven fabrics have some type of dart in them to enable them to stretch. I hope I said woven patterns. Yeah, that's what I meant. Most knit patterns don't, because a knit pattern is going to fit because it's able to stretch out and to grow bigger and then to shrink back down and regain its shape. Now, your knits come in various recoveries and various stretching. You have some knits that will only stretch this way but won't stretch this way. So put a check mark there. Okay. And then you have some knits that stretch in both directions. Okay. But either way, you need to make sure you get the appropriate knit for what you're using. And the knits that only stretch in one direction, you need to make sure that your pattern is a little smaller this way, but it fits correctly vertically. So like for instance, if we had a t-shirt pattern that was supposed to be on a knit that doesn't stretch long ways, it needs to be perfectly long, as long as it needs to be. But it can stand to be just a little bit shorter horizontally, just because it doesn't need as much horizontal because it stretches. Now the crazy thing about it though is that a garment that only, or a fabric that only stretches one way, from what I've seen, they don't stretch a whole lot, because somewhere in the way that the fabric is made, the vertical would have to aid it in its stretching. So since the vertical does not stretch, and it only stretches horizontally, the horizontal can only do so much because the vertical is keeping it from really being able to stretch its full potential. But yeah, so, and this is just an example of a t-shirt pattern that's really ugly. See, that's why I be blowing the board so that it dries and it doesn't smudge. So yeah, so it's a really quick version of a t-shirt pattern. There's no darts in this whatsoever, because as long as your neck is within a certain size, and especially if you sew anything to it, as long as the stitches stretch wide enough, and as long as your hem is wide enough, and as long as your armholes and stuff are within that range where it will stretch, you can put it over your head and it'll go back into shape and it'll look nice and pretty. That's how they make t-shirts that don't have these humongous openings, because you don't need a humongous opening. You just need an opening that's big enough for someone to be able to put their head and their arms and their torso through. But anyway, hopefully you learned a lot. I know this video was kind of long, but I tried to explain it very, very well and very thoroughly about how to change something from the bias to, from the straight grain to the bias, and explain why that doesn't really work exactly. And you have to do some editing and some changing. Also, by the way, because this stretches, it's probably going to stretch vertically, you may need to take some off of the top and add to the width. It just depends, which is why you have to go and do your fitting all over again, because it's going to change the dynamic of the pattern, and it's not going to be the same pattern. Or, and another good way to look at that is, the pattern for something on straight grain could look like this, and then the pattern for something on the bias could look like, let's say I'll make it a little shorter here and make it just a tad bit longer there. Okay, even though that's not 100%, I hope you can tell. I tried to make it a little bigger here and a little longer on the shoulder, and a little wider here in the other spots. So anyway, it's one of those things you have to try to really get it. So hopefully you got it. And that's it. See you next time.